In 578 AD, a group of temple carpenters from the Korean kingdom of Baekje arrived in Osaka to build a temple called Shiten-no-ji. 3 of those carpenters stayed. They founded a construction company. That company was still building temples in Osaka in the year 2005. Not a museum, not a preserved guild. An operating company with employees, contracts, and a payroll for 1,427 consecutive years. It survived the fall of 9 separate shogunates, 2 atomic bombs dropped on its own country, and the complete collapse of the empire it once served. It only stopped operating independently in 2006, when it was absorbed as a subsidiary into a larger construction group, arguably the first real interruption to its continuity in a millennium and a half. Compare that to the average lifespan of a company on the S&P 500 today, under 20 years. We talk a lot on this channel about how old money in the West preserves wealth, dynasty trusts, GRATs, the legal architecture that lets a fortune outlive the person who built it. But the family that founded that Osaka construction firm never heard of a trust. Neither did the merchant families who built Japan's other great commercial houses, Mitsui, Sumitomo, Konoike, dynasties that in some cases have preserved wealth and business continuity for over 400 years using a completely different toolkit. No trust law, no estate attorneys, no offshore structures. Instead, a house code, a flexible definition of son, and a ruthless separation between the family's bloodline and the family's business. Today, we're taking that toolkit apart, piece by piece. If mechanisms like this are what you come here for, not the aesthetics of wealth, but the actual legal and structural machinery behind it, subscribe now, because we're about to go deep into a system most Western audiences have never had explained to them properly. 1. The problem. Every dynasty has to solve every dynasty, and every culture is trying to solve the same equation. How do you keep an asset intact across a transition that destroys most assets? The death of the person who controls it. In the West, the answer usually separates ownership from the person by using a legal fiction, a trust, a foundation, a holding company that owns the asset forever, while beneficiaries merely draw from it. We've covered this extensively. The trust is not a strategy, it's a container. It's older than the tax code, and its function is to make the asset immortal, even though the human is not. Japan's merchant houses arrived at a strikingly similar insight, roughly 4 centuries before Western dynasty trusts became common practice, but they built the container out of family identity itself, not legal paper. The core concept is called IE, usually translated as household, but that translation undersells it badly. The IE was not the family, it was the enterprise, treated as a continuous legal and moral person that happened to be run by a family. The people were temporary custodians. The IE was permanent. This is the single hardest idea for a modern Western viewer to absorb, so let's sit with it for a second. In most Western inheritance thinking, even dynastic thinking, the family is the fixed point, and the business is the variable, something the family owns, builds, sells, or loses. In the IE system practiced by merchant houses like Mitsui and Sumitomo, it was inverted. The business, the name, the shop, the trade relationships, the accumulated capital, was the fixed point. The family occupying it was the variable. That single inversion explains almost everything else we're going to cover today. Why biological sons could be disinherited without much sentiment. Why total strangers, could be legally adopted as heirs overnight, and why some of these houses have now outlasted every royal dynasty in Europe. Japan's merchant class rose during the Edo period, roughly 1603 to 1867. Over 2.5 centuries of enforced peace under the Tokugawa shogunate. Peace is the quiet variable in this story that people underrate. With no wars to fight and a rigid caste system that technically ranked merchants below samurai, farmers, and artisans, merchant families had 2.5 uninterrupted centuries to do one thing obsessively: refine the machinery of commercial continuity. They weren't distracted by succession wars or land seizures the way European aristocratic houses periodically were. They were free to engineer, and engineer they did. 2. The House Code, Japan's unwritten trust document. If a Western dynasty trust is defined by its trust deed, the document that says who the trustee is, who the beneficiaries are, and under what conditions money moves, the Japanese merchant house was governed by something called a kakun, a house code. The word itself is built from 2 characters, house and precept, or code. Originally, these were moral guides passed down within samurai and military households, dating back to at least the Kamakura shogunate in the 12th century. It was only during the Edo period that merchant families began writing their own versions. And once they did, the kakun became something closer to a hybrid of constitution, ethics manual, and operating agreement. 3 examples make this concrete. Sumitomo's founding precepts, known as the Monjuin Shigaki, instructed descendants, in essence, that in business, trust must be prioritized over the pursuit of profit, and that easy gains should never be chased. That is not a soft value statement. That is a governance rule. It tells every future Sumitomo family head, explicitly, to reject the kind of short-term speculative decision-making that destroys multi-generational capital. It is functionally identical to a spendthrift clause in a Western trust, a rule written by the founder to bind the judgment of descendants he would never meet. Mitsui's house laws made a similar move, instructing that the long-term prosperity of the house depended on simplicity, frugality, and placing family harmony above individual ambition. And the wider merchant culture of the Kansai region, particularly among the Omi merchants whose ethics spread into Osaka's commercial class, coined arguably the most famous business principle in Japanese history, Sampo Yōshi, good for the seller, good for the buyer, good for society, 3-way satisfaction. Profit was only legitimate if it produced no losers. Here's why this matters mechanically, not just philosophically. A kakun wasn't just advice. It was often paired with actual institutional teeth. The Mitsui family didn't stop at moral precepts. In 1694, 3 years after the family was granted status as chartered merchants by the shogunate, the Mitsui family drafted what historians now describe, without much exaggeration, as a constitution. It detailed the duties of a family council, a governing body that met periodically to control business and personal matters, and it specified exactly how much property was due to each branch of the family. That last detail is the important one. The Mitsui Constitution didn't just moralize about frugality. It preemptively solved the single most common cause of dynastic collapse: sibling disputes over division of assets. By fixing the entitlements of each branch in writing in advance, the family removed the negotiation from every future succession. There was nothing to fight over because the document had already decided it. Over 2 centuries before Mitsui became the largest of Japan's zaibatsu conglomerates, controlling more than 270 companies by the end of the Second World War. If you're the kind of viewer who wants the actual clause-level mechanics of how families prevent this kind of collapse, not just the philosophy, hit like right now. It tells the algorithm this channel should keep making content like this instead of more lifestyle fluff. The mechanism underneath the Mitsui constitution had a name too: the omotokata. This was effectively a central house treasury, a pooled family bank that held the combined capital of all Mitsui business lines and family branches as a single, undivided asset. Individual family members and branch businesses could draw on it and contribute to it, but no single branch could unilaterally extract its share and walk away. In 1774, a dispute briefly broke this arrangement, splitting off a portion of family assets from central control. But by 1797, the principle of unified omotokata control was deliberately restored. The family recognized, even in the 18th century, that fragmenting the capital pool was an existential threat, and they rebuilt the wall. If that sounds familiar, it should. It's structurally identical to what a modern dynasty trust or family limited partnership does in the West. Pool the capital under central control, let individuals draw income, but make it structurally difficult for any one heir to break off a chunk of principal and dissolve the whole. The omotokata was Japan's dynasty trust. It just wore different clothes. 3. The radical solution: adopting your way out of failure. Now we get to the part of this system that Western audiences find hardest to process, and it is the single most important mechanism in the entire story. In a Western dynasty, when the heir is incompetent, weak-willed, or simply uninterested, the family is largely stuck. Bloodline is fixed. You can disinherit a child in favor of a different child, or in extreme cases skip a generation, but you cannot simply manufacture a new, more capable heir out of thin air. The genetic lottery, once run, cannot be rerun. Japanese merchant houses solved this by treating the definition of son as a legal category, not a biological one. The practice is called Yōshi and Gumi, adult adoption, and the numbers on how central this was to merchant continuity are startling. Research into the IE system suggests that adoption supplied heirs for roughly a quarter of samurai-class families, dramatically reducing family extinction rates that otherwise ran above 40%. Among merchant families, the reliance on adoption appears to have been just as significant, and it served a very specific commercial function. It let capital-holding families recruit management talent from outside the bloodline whenever the bloodline itself failed to produce it. Here's how it worked in practice. A merchant house patriarch with no capable son, or, just as commonly, with several sons, but none suited to running the business, would legally adopt an adult, typically a man in his 20s or 30s, chosen specifically for demonstrated commercial ability. This wasn't adoption in the Western sense of taking in a child. The adoptee was often already an accomplished junior employee, a talented apprentice from within the firm, or a proven merchant from an allied house. He was, in effect, headhunted into the family. A particularly common variation was called mukoyoshi, literally adopted son-in-law. Here, the adoptee married one of the family's daughters and took the family surname, becoming both a son and a husband simultaneously. This let the biological bloodline continue through the daughter, while the actual operating authority, the headship of the business, passed to a man selected for competence rather than birth order. It is, when you think about it, an almost perfect solution to the problem every dynasty eventually runs into. How do you preserve the family name and lineage while still installing the best possible CEO? And this wasn't a rare, desperate measure. It was routine, expected, and legally unremarkable. Under Japan's civil code, which formalized centuries of prior custom when it was enacted in 1898, adult adoption required both parties to be over the age of consent, and the adopted heir had to be at least 1 day younger than the adoptive parent. But beyond that, the process was straightforward. Even today, ordinary adult adoption remains far more common in Japan than child adoption. Well over 90% of the roughly 80,000 adoptions registered in Japan in recent years involve adults, not children. A statistic almost no Western audience would guess, and one that only makes sense once you understand its origin in exactly this kind of merchant house succession logic. The flip side of this system was equally uncompromising: disinheritance. If an adopted heir proved incapable, dishonest, or disloyal, the adoption could be legally dissolved. The adoptee returned to his birth family, stripped of the name, the business, and the inheritance. One of the starkest documented examples comes from the Yasuda family, one of the 4 great Zaibatsu houses, alongside Mitsui, Mitsubishi, and Sumitomo. The Yasuda patriarch disinherited his own adopted heir, a man who had already risen to vice president within the business, when the succession judgment called for it. The family's authority to make that call, cleanly and without prolonged legal battle, was baked into the system from the start. Here's a genuine question for the comments. If your own family business ran on a rule where competence could override bloodline entirely, where a stranger could be legally made your brother tomorrow if he could run the company better than you, would that make the business stronger, or would it destroy the emotional core of what a family is supposed to be? Drop your honest take below. We read every one of these. Put simply, Western dynasties protect the asset by building a legal wall between the asset and the family so that flawed heirs can't damage what they inherit. Japanese merchant houses protected the asset by keeping the family fluid enough that a flawed heir simply wasn't installed as heir in the first place. Different tool, same target, making sure competence, not chance of birth, sits in the seat of power. There's one more layer worth adding here, because it explains why this system didn't just produce competent heirs. It produced heirs who behaved consistently with the house's values, even 100 years after the founder had died. Before an adoption was finalized, particularly a mukoyoshi arrangement, joining a promising junior clerk to the family through marriage, houses like Sumitomo and Mitsui didn't just evaluate a candidate's business acumen. They evaluated whether the candidate had internalized the house's cocoon, whether he could be trusted to run the business according to the family's specific ethical code. The Sampo Yōshi framework of seller, buyer, and society, all benefiting simultaneously, rather than simply maximizing short-term returns. A brilliant merchant who was reckless, greedy, or willing to cut corners on trust was, by the house's own logic, a worse successor than a merely competent one who had absorbed the family's discipline. This is effectively values-based succession screening, formalized as legal adoption criteria 300 years before cultural fit became a phrase in Western corporate hiring. 4. When primogeniture actually helped, it would be too simple to say Japanese merchant houses abandoned bloodline entirely in favor of pure meritocracy. The real system was a layered compromise, and understanding the layers matters. Early in the Edo period, inheritance among the samurai class, whose legal norms merchants largely followed, since formal succession law technically only governed samurai, actually favored the son of greatest demonstrated merit, not automatically the eldest. It was only as the Edo period matured, and as peace made succession disputes less existential, that inheritance by the eldest son hardened into the dominant norm across Japan, a pattern that, in some respects, persists today. But merchant houses layered a crucial safety valve on top of primogeniture: the family council. Multiple merchant houses, including Mitsui, built formal councils composed of senior family members from different branches, who would convene periodically to review not just finances, but the fitness of the presumptive heir. If the eldest son was deemed unfit, the council had the standing authority to look elsewhere, to a younger son, to a muka Yōshi, to an adopted outsider entirely. This is worth pausing on because it's a governance innovation that most modern founder-led companies still struggle to replicate. A family council with real veto power over succession is functionally similar to an independent board of directors with fiduciary authority over CEO selection, except this board was bound by blood, marriage, and centuries of shared precept rather than by corporate law. It gave these houses something rare, a mechanism to correct a bad heir before that heir did damage, rather than after. Contrast this with the rigid rule of agnatic primogeniture that governed, for example, the Japanese imperial succession itself under the 1889 Imperial House Law. Eldest son to eldest son, full stop, with almost no mechanism for merit-based correction. The imperial house had permanence of a different kind, political and symbolic, not commercial. The merchant houses, competing in markets that punished incompetence within a single generation, could not afford that rigidity. They built in a release valve. That difference, rigid primogeniture at the top of Japanese society, flexible merit-based succession within its merchant class, is itself a small case study in what happens when an institution has to survive market competition versus when it only has to survive ceremonially. 5. The Zaibatsu, scaling the house into an empire. Everything we've covered so far explains how a merchant house survived. It doesn't yet explain how some of these houses became genuinely enormous. That transformation happened during the Meiji Restoration, beginning in 1868, when Japan abandoned feudal isolation and rapidly industrialized to avoid the fate of colonized neighbors. Merchant houses with centuries of accumulated capital, disciplined governance, and, critically, a house code that had already trained generations of family members to think in terms of long-horizon stewardship rather than short-term extraction, were uniquely positioned to convert that advantage into industrial-scale conglomerates. Mitsui became the oldest of the 4 major Zaibatsu, family-centered business conglomerates, and by the end of the Second World War, the family's holdings spanned finance, industry, and commerce through a controlling holding company structure established in 1909. Sumitomo and Konoike, the old Edo-era houses, reinvented themselves the same way, moving from money lending and retail into banking, mining, and heavy industry. The Zaibatsu were, structurally, the Omotokata principle scaled up to national economy size. A family holding company sat at the apex, controlling a pyramid of operating businesses below it, all ultimately answerable to family governance built on centuries-old precept. It's genuinely one of history's cleaner examples of a governance technology originally designed to keep a single merchant shop intact across a single family transition, scaling almost without modification to control a meaningful share of an entire nation's industrial output. Konoike is the case study that shows this scaling wasn't unique to Mitsui. The Konoike house began, like many Osaka merchant families, in sake brewing and shipping, before pivoting into money lending and eventually banking, a trajectory almost identical to Mitsui's shift from textiles into finance. What's most instructive about Konoike, though, is how heavily documented its internal governance became. Historians who've studied the house's surviving records point to detailed kakun and shop regulations that governed not just the family's own conduct, but the training, discipline, and eventual promotion of non-family clerks working inside Konoike's businesses. A reminder that these house codes weren't purely about controlling who inherited the top seat. They were full management systems, dictating how loyalty and competence were cultivated inside the organization long before a succession decision ever had to be made. By the time a Konoike patriarch needed to identify a capable heir, whether biological or adopted, the house already had years of documented performance data on every internal candidate. Succession wasn't a single dramatic decision made at a deathbed. It was the final step of a selection process that had effectively been running for decades. That detail matters because it undercuts a common misreading of this whole system, the idea that adoption was some kind of emergency escape hatch, only used when a family got desperate. In the best-run houses, it wasn't an escape hatch. It was simply the last stage of an ongoing, rigorous internal talent pipeline that happened to have the legal flexibility to promote all the way to family member if the bloodline came up short. If this is the first time you're seeing how a 400-year-old house code scaled into a national industrial empire, share this video with one person who thinks old money is just a European concept, because this is a parallel system that most Western wealth content completely ignores. Then came the collapse, or what looked briefly like one. After Japan's surrender in 1945, the Allied occupation authorities specifically identified the zaibatsu as a threat to democratic reconstruction and ordered them dissolved. On paper, this was total. Family holding companies were broken up, cross-shareholdings were unwound, and the great houses lost their formal legal control over the empires they'd spent centuries building. But here is the detail that matters most for a channel about how wealth actually survives disruption. Dissolution on paper is not the same as dissolution in practice. Through the 1950s, many of the formerly zaibatsu-controlled companies reformed their commercial ties in a less formal arrangement known as Keiretsu, a network of companies linked by mutual shareholding, shared banking relationships, and long-standing business custom rather than unified family ownership. The legal apparatus of family control was dismantled. The relational and cultural apparatus, built up over centuries of precept, trust, and repeated dealing, proved far harder to dissolve by occupation order. Mitsui and Sumitomo both persist today as recognizable commercial groupings, even without the family holding structure that once defined them. This is, arguably, the single most important lesson in the entire story. Legal structures can be dismantled by a government decree in a matter of months. Culture, trust, and multi-generational relationship capital cannot be dismantled nearly as easily. The house code outlived the house. 6. The Shinise. Why 33,000 Japanese companies are over a century-old zoom out from the famous zaibatsu names, and an even stranger statistic emerges. Japan has a specific word, Shinise, literally old shop, for a business that has operated continuously for at least a century. And Japan has more of them than any other country on Earth by an enormous margin. Depending on which survey you consult, Japan is home to somewhere between 33,000 and 52,000 companies over 100 years old. Compare that to the United States. which ranks a distant second globally with under 20,000. Of Japan's centenarian companies, roughly 3,000 have passed 200 years. Around 140 have passed 500 years, and at least 19 to 21 claim to have operated continuously for over 1,000 years. Though for the very oldest of these, exact founding dates rest more on internal company tradition than on independently verifiable documentation, and that caveat should be treated honestly rather than glossed over. The extreme case is Kongo Gumi, the temple construction firm we opened this video with, founded in 578 AD, and by most accounts, the oldest continuously operating company in documented business history, having built and repaired temples for roughly 14 centuries before its 2006 absorption as a subsidiary into the Takamatsu Construction Group. Not far behind it are hospitality businesses, Nishiyama Onsen Keiyunkan, a hot spring hotel in Yamanashi Prefecture, founded in the year 705, still recognized as the oldest continuously operating hotel in the world, and Hoshi Ryokan, an inn founded in 718, run by the same family across generations for over 13 centuries. Before we wrap up the philosophical takeaway here, if you want to see how a completely different old money system, European dynastic families, using trusts, GRATs, and formal legal structures, arrives at a strikingly similar outcome through opposite methods, go watch our video on Dynasty Trusts next. The link's on screen now, and it's the perfect companion piece to what you just learned. What ties all of these Shinise together isn't luck. Researchers who study Japan's centenarian firms, most notably Toshio Goto, who directs a research institute dedicated specifically to studying centennial management, point to a consistent pattern. These businesses treat the company as inherited family stewardship rather than personal property. They resist rapid expansion in favor of staying at what one analysis calls their true size. They avoid speculative debt even during boom periods, like Japan's 1980s asset bubble, and they treat brand reputation, the norin, or shop curtain, which functions as a stand-in for accumulated trust, as an asset that, once damaged, is essentially unrecoverable. And crucially, when a biological successor lacks the necessary capability, the same Yōshi adoption mechanism we described earlier is still, today, actively used to bring in an outside successor rather than let a Shinise fail for want of an heir. It's worth being honest about the pressure this system is now under. Japan's aging, shrinking population means a growing number of Shinese face what demographers call the succession crisis. An aging owner with genuinely no willing heir, biological or otherwise. When that happens, a centenarian firm has exactly three options: find an adopted or outside successor, sell to a larger group, or close permanently. The fact that Japan's Shinise count keeps climbing, even as this pressure intensifies, suggests the adoption-based succession toolkit is still doing real work behind the scenes, 400 years after it was first formalized in a merchant house code. 7. Synthesis. Two different toolkits. One identical goal. So let's put the two systems side by side because the comparison is the entire point of this video. A Western dynasty trust separates legal ownership from the individual, using a document, enforced by courts, to keep an asset intact, regardless of who's born into the family or how competent they turn out to be. It solves the succession problem by making the asset legally indifferent to the humans around it. A Japanese merchant house separated identity from bloodline instead. The i.e., the house, was the permanent legal and moral entity. The family occupying it was replaceable, correctable, and expandable through adoption whenever bloodline failed to produce a capable steward. It solved the exact same succession problem. How do you stop one incompetent generation from destroying centuries of accumulated capital? Not by locking the asset away from people, but by making sure the right people were always available to run it. Neither system eliminated risk entirely. Mitsui had to rebuild its central treasury after a 1774 fracture. The Yasuda family had to disinherit an heir who'd already reached the vice presidency. Kongo Gumi, after 1,427 years of independent operation, still needed rescuing by a larger construction group in 2006, when debt from an unrelated real estate venture threatened to end it, proof that even the most battle-tested house code isn't immune to bad late-stage decisions. But the core insight holds across both systems, 4 centuries and 1 ocean apart. Wealth that survives across generations is never really about the money. It's about the governance wrapped around the money, the rules written by people who understood they wouldn't be alive to enforce them personally, so they built mechanisms that would enforce themselves. A trust document, a house code, different paper, same function, making sure the family's judgment outlives the family's individual members. That carpentry firm from 578 AD didn't survive 14 centuries because one family was extraordinarily lucky, generation after generation, for 58 consecutive generations. It survived because the house, not the bloodline, was built to be the thing that lasted. If you want the deep dive on how Western dynasties achieve something structurally similar through buy, borrow, die, Gratz, and dynasty trust law, that video is linked on screen and in the description. Watch that next to complete the full picture of how generational wealth actually survives on 2 completely different continents, using 2 completely different tools. Subscribe if you haven't, because Old Money Opulence is the only channel breaking down the actual mechanics behind old wealth, not the aesthetic, the architecture. New video every week.